Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today we need to talk about Iraq, and I'm going to start with a video, just a short clip.
I asked this question to a United States official. I asked this person, what are you doing? How can you possibly back Israel in its attack on Palestinians in this way? And the answer was mind-blowing. We did it before. We did it in Iraq, and you all forgot about it. And you'll forget about this too. That was the answer from the lips of an American diplomat to me about this question. And
Right, so this, I think, is part of the reason we need to talk about Iraq. Iraq, the issue of what the US did in Iraq is not separate from what is happening in Gaza now. Indeed, some people are starting to ask whether we are seeing World War III happening, and I would say that we've been seeing World War III happening for nearly a quarter of a century, as I'll explain, and in fact this isn't even the most violent period of it. It's merely the one where we're getting the greatest awareness of what's going on. But in the past we have had a period where there were considerably more refugees than there were during World War II. And that should have alerted us to something major going on. But going back to Iraq in particular, Iraq is linked to Palestine because they are both Middle Eastern countries. They have historical links, but they are conjoined in imperial eyes because of the issue of oil. Iraq is very important to for the UK and the US because of its oil, and the original reason for supporting the creation of a state of Israel was in the pursuance of the domination of Middle Eastern oil, and they have never been uncoupled. In fact, their history under their modern history is under the mandates and then the foreign interference of the imperial powers after World War One has been linked, but of course they also have the countries are linked going back thousands of years, really. So Iraq poses a particular problem, as we'll see, for imperial powers. It has oil, it has oil that is very light in grade, so it's very cheap to refine compared to heavier oils such as you would find in Venezuela, or even heavier such as the tar sands in Alberta. It's pretty easy to get it out of the ground. It's a very, as oil prices go up, the margins on that sort of oil skyrocket. So from an imperial perspective, what you don't want is for a country, a populous country, to be able to use that sort of wealth to develop an independent regional power base, economically and militarily, either or. So Iraq is difficult because, as we'll see from its history, when you put a client in charge of Iraq, they tend to be pushed into a nationalist corner by the functioning of the society itself. So I think we need to grapple with Iraq because people probably have some awareness of the horrors that came out of Iraq, but I think they have faded from memory. And I think part of the reason they've faded is because with the news media and the standard Western interpretation has lent into this idea of it being an unintentional thing. So we don't have a narrative of genocide, basically, which is, we are talking about decades of genocide, which explains what was going on and why it was happening. The US actions in Iraq are far, far more horrific than people really can almost believe. And I think one of the horrors is that certain people who have enough power to control things, their object was not, I don't know, get rid of Saddam Hussein or whatever. Their object was destroy the country and kill as many people as possible. And when children were starving, it was because people had calculated ways of starving them, and they pursued that relentlessly. So what you're seeing happen in Gaza now is people are starting to wake up to the fact that there is an absolutely brutal genocidal logic that is almost inhuman and hard to even fathom is playing out as we're coming to grasp the level of dogged violence that Israel is pursuing in Gaza, that seems to be endless, that seems to go nowhere apart from total extermination. Well, this logic was very much in the strategies used by the US and UK in their choices when fighting wars and their choices during the sanctions period. And the amount of suffering that came about because of that is almost incalculable. So this will be, hopefully a bit of an eye opener for people that it is a lot worse than you think it was. But currently we have somewhat of a problem in that people's urgency over what is happening in
It's true.
in Gaza is causing them to maybe misrepresent what happened in Iraq in order to, I think, foolishly try to create a sense of urgency, which I don't think is necessary to misrepresent what happened in Iraq in order to create a sense of urgency over what's happening in Gaza. Honestly, so we have some interesting instances where people have changed the historical record somewhat to try and downplay the level of suffering in Iraq in order to make what's happening in Gaza to seem more unprecedented. So here we have, for example, this graph. This graph shows number of journalists and media workers killed by war. This is from a paper written by Nick Terse. The author is a very good paper, the author of Kill Anything That Moves. However, this graph has something very interesting going on because, as Terse's notes say down here, more journalists in total were killed in the Iraq war than in war in Gaza. So we have Gaza here, and they clearly want this big outstanding thing showing this comparison. But if you put in Iraq, it would be somewhat above that. Now, Terse says that there is no comparison because the media workers in Iraq were killed over a longer period of time, and he says roughly 13 per year because he calculates from March 2003 to March 2025. Now, you could say, the other wars cited there are many of them are about around the 10-year mark. Afghanistan is 20 years, and none of them are taken out because of that. In fact, if you weren't on the rules, he is applying to Iraq. Uh, Not that he's saying that's why it's excluded from the graph, but we can kind of see a sort of apology there for this exclusion. If those were the rules, then none of the other, it would just be a graph with one thing in it, which I think is actually, quite telling. But if you wanted to show the rate of deaths of journalists, you could produce a graph like that. But the other thing is, of course, that he is very misleading to take such a long period in Iraq's war history and reduce it to 13 per year, because the vast majority of those people died within the span of 3 to 4 years. So why are people doing this? You have to ask yourself. And there is maybe an even worse example. I don't know. It's all a bit disturbing, quite frankly. That is this common thing here. It's another graph, and it shows child deaths. So this comes from Al Jazeera, who of course were absolutely crucial in reporting from Iraq. They were heroic in many ways, and lost journalists doing it, of course. But this is child deaths in conflict zones, killed per day. And this is a 30-day period in Gaza, 136 per day. There is very little like that, certainly in the comparisons they have here. But Trita Parsi here is, of course, this is the thing, they're taking a 30-day period, and I don't, given that we know that there is an undercount of the total mortality, I don't begrudge them at all doing that, but look at what they're doing with the other things. And Trita Parsi says, in Ukraine, 0.7 children were killed per day, and that is a pretty accurate figure. That is that up to the point of recording. And then he says in Iraq it was 0.6. But we have a look at the dates. That it's from 2008 to 2022. So they're literally excluding the time of the greatest violence in Iraq to try and make a point about Gaza. And I think this is at best a real pity, but it also, I don't think it does the cause any good, because there are so many linkages between the two. So in order to understand quite exactly why Iraq is so central, and why the US waged a 30-year campaign of genocide against Iraq, roughly from 1980 through to 2012, and arguably beyond. The US was basically committing a very brutal genocide through vastly different means at different times. But we'll see that. later. So to understand why, I need to go back to explain some of the history here. So the region is often referred to as Mesopotamia. That means the middle of rivers, referring to the Tigris and Euphrates. So this area became the cradle of civilization, and this is in part because the rivers created fertility through flooding that was and allowed easy irrigation. So this meant a centralization of activity, division of labor, and so forth. This led to people being able to seize control of the irrigation and thus seize control of the population. Now, irrigation can occur communally, as I talked about recently on a 1 or 200 podcast. It can be organized communally. It doesn't have to be controlled by some sort of hierarchy, but it provides the means for someone to gain political power like that, and which is called a hydraulic despotism. So the name Iraq, some suggest it actually dates right back to Uruk, which is a city founded 7,000 years ago, Sumerian city. Others see an Arabic etymology for it. Coming from a word for well-watered or fertile, which suits the area. Obviously, Arabic came a lot later. The name Iraq Arabi dates back over 1,000 years, and in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was Iraq Arabica, which is a European term for the area. So the name is quite old and refers more or less to Mesopotamia, but it's not inconsistent with the idea of modern Iraq. So within what is today's Iraq was the ancient civilization of Sumer, which we considered the world's earliest civilization. It emerged between 6,000 and 5,000 BC. And then other civilizations arose in the region, or within Iraq's current day borders. So they weren't all in the same place. They include the Akkadian, Neo-Sumerian, Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian, and Neo-Babylonian. So it's Neo-Babylonian Empire was quite big, and it conquered, among other places, the lands of modern-day Palestine for the most part, as we'll see. And in 587 BC, so this is like an early link to the Levant and modern-day Palestine, was the conquest by Babylon. Although another one was that Akkadian was the diplomatic language of the time, and relations between Egypt and Mesopotamia were for thousands of years kind of mediated with this area of Palestine as quite an important area for Egypt as well. So there was engagement from long before 587 BC or BCE. So in 587, the Neo-Babylonians captured the kingdom of Judah after, like, other Hebrew kingdoms had already been conquered, disintegrated, sent into exile, or whatever, according to various ways of telling the story. The what happened then was what's called the Babylonian captivity, where a lot of the leaders of Judah were taken to Mesopotamia and kept there, and that is where we get the the old song by the waters of Babylon. We lay down and wept when we remembered Zion, which is a hill in Jerusalem. And of course that was later kind of reimagined by Boney M, by the rivers of Babylon, etc. So this is part of a very strong part of Jewish historiography / religious kind of religious narrative, is about the loss of Judah and then dreaming of going back to Zion and the return and so forth, exile and return. Now, I'll just quickly show you a map of Neo-Babylon here, and I'll show you this for a particular reason, which is hard to point to, but hopefully you'll be able to see. In here, I'm in the way, so I'll just have to move myself out of the way. In here, you see this? Gaza. So, and look at that. Isn't that a lot like the Gaza Strip there, with the city there? Well, the reason for that was that, as I said, the Egyptians had they had direct rule over some parts of modern-day Palestine, or a lot of it at one point, and retained strong connections to these client states later in that area. So they became, they remained independent of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And I only bring this up to show you that some things actually, I'm not suggesting for a second that Gaza actually belongs to the Egyptians or anything like that. What I'm suggesting is that some of the lines on the map are not as arbitrary as modern-day Western people would have you believe. There are often geographical reasons that lines are drawn where they are. It is not simply that the British and the French just kind of wrestled over a pen and drew these lines and then sowed all of this insoluble problem for later that can only be done by partitioning countries, which is one of the things they say. A lot of the places where lines were arbitrary were actually areas of desert, so that the significance of shifting 100 kilometers this way or that way is actually not as much as you might think. So and the obvious example of this would be the Jordan River, and then you have, there's all sorts of geographical features that delineate various things. I will probably return to this later when we're talking about other things. But the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians under Cyrus the Great, who let the leaders from the kingdom of Judah go. So he's, I believe, he's considered righteous among the Gentiles for that. Now, one of the things is a digression here. I want to say also that by 450 BCE, or around that time, we know from Herodotus that the area roughly corresponding to Palestine today was known as Palestine. Now, the name had developed because, like 600 years earlier, some people came, part of the invasion of the Sea Peoples. Some people came who were known as Philistine, or Philistines, as Bible readers will currently know them, and they had kingdom. They had cities in a kind of kingdom around today's Gaza and a bit further north, and so um, they and then the name became a kind of more general term for the area. Intriguingly, there is also a possibility that it also corresponded to a Hebrew name. It had a Hebrew origin, so that these two different origins came together to create one term for the region. But what we need to account for, both way back in Herodotus' time and going forwards to like the Romans when they used the term Palestine, is that the link between them and the original people who the barbarian invaders, the Sea Peoples called Philistines, is kind of lost. It's a much broader term and would remain so until modern history, referring to a geographical region, not a specific origin. So it creates its own identity over time, as things do. And this is something I'll return to when talking about Iraq in the modern era. Once you create borders and this sort of identity, it tends to have a life of its own. And so going back to Iraq, so after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, there was a good 1,000 years there of lots of different people ruling. Usually, not from there. It wasn't the center of empire until the Rashidun Caliphate, which founded Kufa in which is 170 kilometers south of today's Baghdad, and it became their capital. Now, so this is the first caliphate. So these are the six successors from the Prophet, peace be upon him. And Kufa is the origin of the kafir. This is where the kafir comes from, so yet another link with Palestine there. Not that Palestine is the only country where the kafir is worn, but it has kind of become a symbol of Palestinian identity, and it originates in Iraq. So obviously this means that even though the most holy places in Islam are Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, the political center almost immediately is in Iraq, and it would kind of stay there for hundreds of years. So the caliphs are both political and spiritual leaders. This is not an unusual thing. If you think about the Byzantine Empire, the ruler there was in very much the same position, except of course that there was also a pope, but the pope didn't have the same significance in Byzantium that the pope did in Western Christendom. So it's not necessarily peculiar to Islam to have this idea of a religious and temporal authority in one. Now, so after there was the in the formation of the caliphate, there was a succession dispute. This led to the split between Sunni and Shia. Um, despite that, the caliph favoured by Shia actually became the fourth in the Rashidun dynasty anyway, which might have brought the two together, but he was assassinated, leading to a new dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty. So the Umayyads moved the capital to Damascus and then to a place in today's southern Turkey called Haran. But the empire was huge at this stage, and it was multi-ethnic and multi-faith, and most of the population in the empire was Christian. So there was Arabic-speaking Muslims formed really a class of political elite. So they were the kind of a top layer, much like feudal, well, no, not really like, but in some ways equivalent to feudal lords in Europe, who really didn't have a particular allegiance to the local population. They didn't necessarily have an origin there, or necessarily lived there. They were given. So again, this is not quite given. They were given authority over particular areas in particular ways as well, due to usually dynastic arrangements. So the idea of having a separate militarily oriented, culturally different group ruling over you was also not quite as exotic at the time as it might seem. This has happened in other places and times as well, of course. So this was the kind of basis there. They practiced religious toleration, especially towards Christians and Jews. They did not proselytize. Interestingly, like, they incentivized conversion to Islam by only mildly, by taxing Muslims less, but of course in doing so they created an incentive to not convert people. So it wasn't it was a military empire with a shared religious identity that wasn't spread as part of the empire. So then in 750 there was a revolution, the Abbasid revolution, and the Abbasid Caliphate was established with notable support from Persians and Shia. And then they ended up with establishing Baghdad, and it became the capital. It became arguably at the time the world centre for science, arts, culture, literature, etc., invention, and this is talked about as the golden age of Islam, although again they're talking about an empire that was mostly not Islamic at the time. But this is the time in which people kind of see as the most righteous in Islamic terms. So they, and yeah, again, that part of that was actually about tolerance as well. So they had a place called the House of Wisdom. Baghdad itself was multi-ethnic and multi-religious. It developed complex bureaucracy, and then they also had The idea of a vizier, who was the right hand man to the caliph, who often was not Sunni, often non-Arab. Um, so in a way, it was a kind of an institution to kind of spread representation in a very non-democratic um, thing. So yeah, perhaps the apogee of this golden age would have been the reign of Harun al-Rashid, and people will be aware of the kind of romanticization of that period in things like 1001 Nights. So just to kind of reinforce the multi-ethnic. I mean, this is an empire, so as these things go along, as every empire goes along, the minorities tend to rise and become, you know, more prominent in positions of power. Although, of course, empires sometimes, of course, spread a central identity which takes over, such as the Han identity and indeed the Arab identity here. So, but in this, nothing really made everyone, no one was ever made monolithic, in the way perhaps like we would associate with Europe, where they had things like, first, like the sort of persecutions for heresy that came out of the um, uh, things like the Council of Nicaea, which decided a particular orthodoxy and put political power behind it. Obviously there is a political orthodoxy here in that it's Sunni, but the reactions to people who are not part of that orthodoxy were less repressive. And if you think about the Albigensian Crusade in Europe, in southern France, where literally millions of people were slaughtered, which then led to the establishment of inquisitions, which spent centuries and centuries and centuries persecuting people for not having the right beliefs. You know, there is nothing like that in, not really. There's conflict, but the that level of enforcement of a particular belief system was lacking. So really, like and if we look at say what's happened in Europe after the Reformation, where different forms of Protestantism, for example, just like do their own thing, and don't even think of like usually don't think of killing each other because of the difference. This is maybe a norm that you see in other countries as well, like China, for example, and stuff. And it is possible that we should look at the way both religion in particularly in Western Europe functioned under the papacy. We should look at that as a rather exceptional level of intolerance. Anyway, so one of the important non-Arab people who came to wield power in this world, in what effectively is a successor state, was Salah ad-Din, who was a Kurd who fought against the Third Crusade, became very famous, liberated Jerusalem, and more or less was really the victor over the Crusaders for the most part. They would never recover that level of power in the Levant, in the Holy Land, ever again. He becomes a sultan in Egypt. Now, a sultan is like an emperor, and it doesn't have the claim of um, religious authority over the entire ummah, the entire Islamic population that being a caliph has. So at this stage, the Abbasid Caliphate had retaken Baghdad and it was like had their own, own realm as well. So in a way, it kind of like if you think of like the Holy Roman Emperor, who had a kind of religious mantle, but um, was also not the Pope, you know. So yeah, so this is like what a sultanate is basically. Now, Salah ad-Din is a massive folk hero, was and is a massive folk hero to Arabs. So the main highway in Gaza is named after him. Saddam Hussein named lots of things after him. And, the Saddam Hussein, he committed genocide against Kurds. But I think it's fair to say that, like, that doesn't mean he personally hated Kurds. It means Kurds were a political inconvenience to him. And his reaction to that was both brutal and counterproductive. So you do get this. So you've got basically a country in Iraq that remains throughout its history always has this blend of Shia and Sunni and Kurdish and Arab, and with the kind of interplay which is not always happy with Persians as well. So before Salah ad-Din, the Crusades had started to create more of a sense of militancy amongst Muslims, but really in 1258, the thing that changed everything more than that was the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols. Once Baghdad was no longer the kind of center that it had been, even when you have like separate sultanates and the caliphate is reduced, and it was still the place, But after that, that changed, and then what happened was that the local sultans would build madrasas and start to create their own Islamic culture, their own Islamic centers, and that led to a lot more conversion. And this is where the Islamization of the Arab world really kicks in. And of course, people after many hundreds of years, linguistically, people are mostly Arabic as well. So yeah. Now, Iraq would come under Ottoman rule from the 16th to the early 20th century, with a bit of an interregnum there, after which the Ottoman Empire took back Iraq, and the Ottoman Empire was divided into provinces or vilayets, and they had 3 vilayets of Al-Iraq that were called Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. You add them together, these borders were defined in 1831, they are very close to modern day Iraq. In one of the Basra Vilayet, it was included at its periphery, let's say, Kuwait, which would later become an emirate. Now, because of political strife, the Kuwait port, while Basra city was undergoing strife, it became important. In 1792, the British East India Company started using it. There was a very the placement of it, of course, for getting to India was significant for them, and so and then in over a century later, the Sheikh who ruled the area, Mubarak al-Sabah, signed an agreement with the British government, the British government in India, called the Anglo-Kuwaiti Agreement of 1899, which made Kuwait a British protectorate. Now, whether Basra had really been able to exert control over the area or not is debatable, but this is why Iraq claims that Kuwait is rightfully part of its territory, is that in fact until that time it was still linked to Basra Vilayet, and of course the Ottomans. I don't think they recognised Kuwait's independence after that time either. Now, fast forwarding a bit to World War One in 1916. There was the Great Arab Revolt. Those of you who know anything about T.E. Lawrence, so Lawrence of Arabia, or have watched the film, will know that during the First World War, there was a revolt of Arabs against the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of focus maybe on irregulars and Bedouins in the cinematic history of that, but about 5,000 of the troops were regular Ottoman army, defectors or mutineers or whatever you want to call them, who fought against the Ottomans. And the vast majority of those people came from those three provinces of Al-Iraq. So at the end of World War One, the British betrayed their promises to give an Arab state that would cover would be vast and one single polity. They also broke the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then they signed an armistice with Turkey, but broke it the next day, or one of their generals did, so he could grab Mosul. Now, Mosul was where the oil comes from, or a lot of the oil. And this was incredibly important to the British Empire. Indeed, Churchill called Iraq a first-class war aim. And I'm just going to grab something. I'll pause and grab something, and I'll come back and explain that. So, as for why Churchill thought Iraq was a first-class war aim, it was because he was part of a certain group of people who saw the conversion to oil is an urgent necessity for the survival of Britain as a world power. I'm going to read an excerpt from this book here, and it will explain some of it. So one of the things about World War One is that both the British and the Germans, their participation had a lot to do, and it was very much not forced on either of them. Their participation had a lot to do with their feeling of a need to secure oil for the future. Right. So the Germans had been working with the Turks to create a Berlin to Baghdad railway. And Winston Churchill, meanwhile, had begun to fret as First Lord of the Admiralty over how he was going to supply the British Navy with fuel after making the momentous decision in 1911 to convert its fuel from coal to the more efficient and economical oil, which Great Britain lacked. The whole fortunes of our race and our empire would perish if our naval supremacy were to be impaired, he confessed. And naval supremacy meant greater speed and efficiency through oil. Quote, the use of oil made it possible in every type of vessel to have more gunpowder and more speed for less size or less cost, end quote. The problem for him and for Great Britain, as it warily monitored the German build-up of its own naval power, was where to find the oil. Churchill had been the first to admit that, quote, oil was not found in appreciable quantities in our islands. To commit the navy irrevocably to oil was indeed to take arms against a sea of troubles, end quote. Small wonder then that gaining control over oil supplies in Persia and Mesopotamia would become, quote, a first-class British war aim. Now, that gives you some idea. Okay, so during the period in which the UK had a mandate over Palestine, they were keen on putting an oil pipeline through Haifa from Mesopotamia, from northern Iraq. Now, that is not the shortest way to get to the Mediterranean. They wanted it there for their own reasons. So, to continue quoting from this book, how far back did this connection between the oil of Iraq and the port of Haifa go, especially in the minds and dreams of Western oilmen and war planners? I knew that the construction of the IPC pipeline dated back to the early 1930s, but as usual, the planning for the pipeline had to precede its construction, and the planning could not take place until the oil was seized and controlled. That takes us back to World War I and the period from 1917 to 18, when seizing of the oil of Iraq became a first-class war aim for the British due to wartime petroleum shortages and Winston Churchill's long-term calculation that the British Navy, now relying on oil instead of coal as its fuel, had to find new sources. Britain's Secretary of the War Cabinet, Sir Maurice Hankey, wrote to Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour that, quote, oil in the next war will occupy the place of coal in the present war, or at least in a parallel place to coal. The only big potential supply we can get under British control is the Persian and Mesopotamian supply." End quote. Balfour, for his part, fretted that declaring the oil of Mesopotamia, now Iraq, a war aim sounded too imperialistic. It would be better, he wrote to Britain's Prime Minister of the Dominions, to call Britain the, quote, guiding spirit, end quote, in Mesopotamia, since Mesopotamian oil was the one resource that Britain did not have. Quote, "I do not care under what system we keep the oil," end quote, Balfour declared, quote, "but I am clear that it is all important for us that this oil should be available," end quote. Britain's capture of Iraq's oil-rich region of Mosul achieved Churchill's first-class war aim, but that, of course, was only half the equation. Once seized, where should the oil be piped? Enter the Balfour Declaration, best known for documenting British government support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The declaration, written in November the 2nd, 1917, begins, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this objective." Right. So you might know the rest of the Balfour Declaration. It's it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, I just want to, just as an aside, and I've said this elsewhere, but people have argued that somehow cunningly the Balfour Declaration used civil rights rather than political, thus leading to some trick or whatever, which is obvious nonsense. Since when have civil rights not included political rights? It would be pretty hard to argue that the voting rights movement in the southern states in the decades leading up to the 1960s wasn't part of the civil rights movement, because that's political. What they actually did with the Balfour Declaration was use it as a specious device, because they got it included in the League mandate. So whenever it was pointed out the impossibility of actually justly creating a Jewish state in Palestine, they would point to that inclusion and say, "Oh, but what about this?" Without actually, so that they kept the question open rather than ever answering it, because it was impossible. The Balfour Declaration does not in any way create the justification for imposing the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And again, this goes back to Balfour's concern that they not be too obvious. So they're kind of stuck with, and they couldn't have been too obvious. So they use it in a duplicitous way to every time they failed to find a way of creating a Jewish state that didn't raise massive objections, then they would just say, "Oh yes, but we have to go back to this," and so forth. Anyway, I'm getting off track here, but I think it's important to understand the role that the Balfour Declaration played. Now, Balfour was part of the clique that included Churchill and some others that were early in recognising the need to switch to oil, which was first pointed out in 1895 by Admiral John Fisher. Anyway, so again, this is a link between Iraq and Palestine. So Iraq becomes a British mandate, and then they install a monarch. Now, so the monarch was Faisal, one of the Hashemites, so related to the monarch they put in place in Jordan as well. He's the son of Hussein, who is the person that the British promised a massive Arab state to. He also, in 1919, signed the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement for Arab-Jewish cooperation. He didn't really have any connection to the region, which is very useful. If you're an imperialist and you want a puppet, you don't want them to have a political constituency where you put them in place, or you want to separate them from it as quickly as possible. And he had conditionally accepted the Balfour Declaration. So he suited the British very well. In the meantime, before he was even sent there as the king, there was a revolt against the British in Iraq, which the British reacted to with extreme violence. Some of the revolt was a tax revolt, and they would bomb villages for not paying their taxes. And Churchill wanted to use mustard gas on the civilian population there. Arthur Harris, who would later be known as Arthur Bomber Harris because of his propensity for brutal strategic bombing, so-called strategic bombing of civilian populations in World War II, which was actually quite unpopular with people in Britain at the time, even though they were enduring the Blitz. He said of Iraqis that they now know what real bombing means in casualties and damage. Within 45 minutes, a full-size village can be practically wiped out and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured. He thought that was jolly good. So in 1930, Chief of Air Staff Hugh Trenchard, who's one of the key theorists who propounded air power, leading to the air power emphasis during World War II on all sides. He told Parliament at Westminster that Iraqi tribesmen, quote, love fighting for fighting's sake and, quote, have no objection to being killed. So this is deeply vicious, deeply racist stuff. It also immediately created a common cause in the mandate that crossed ethnic, religious, sectarian, and political divides. So it kind of the presence of the British started the formation of what I'll call the Iraqi genos here to kind of explain why there was a need later for genocide. So any polity with set borders and freedom of movement within it tends to form a genos because people travel and have intermarriage and that sort of thing. And then you also have like centralized institutions that promote that sort of travel. So teachers might take postings in different places, or medical staff and so forth. You can like this is how you would successfully knit together a community, and it's not by ending diversity, It's not by trying to suppress minorities, it's by creating a different identity that embraces that diversity. Something that fucking Saddam Hussein should have, well, the world would have been a better place if he'd known that. He, when he was trying to suppress independence-minded Kurds, he created a program of Arabization where he sent Arabs into low-cost housing in majority Kurdish areas. But if you do that sort of thing, you are simply deepening division. Whereas if you create institutions where people retain their identity but intermingle, then you create another identity on top of that. And as much as Hussein was an arsehole in so many ways, this was happening in Iraq despite him anyway. And indeed was happening before him as well. So one of the things with a country that has literally the longest history on the planet, and has this diversity, but the diversity is not necessarily antipathetic to the greater identity. After all, Iraq doesn't mean Sunnistan or whatever. It's not exclusive to any particular group, and yet it has a resonance that goes back at least 1,000 years, possibly 7,000 years. You know, so it has this, and it also has has resources, and it has a reasonable sort of population. And consequently, I think that leaders have not been loyal to their imperial overlords. So, for example, Faisal's King Ghazi of Iraq, who ruled from 1933 to 39, he had an anti-imperialist radio station that he ran from his palace until he died in a car accident that a lot of people think was engineered by a guy called Nouri al-Said, who was loyal to the British. Nouri al-Said almost kind of fits the wicked vizier sort of cliche mold, as it were, to some extent perhaps. But he was always pro-British, and he served as Prime Minister under three kings. He was briefly relocated in 1941, had to flee the country because there was a nationalist coup by military officers who aligned themselves with the Axis powers, which led to the British invading the country and reinstalling the monarchy and Nouri al-Said in 1958. So that's how long he was there, that very long time. 1958, there was another nationalist coup led by Abdel Karim Qasim. This had a very strong anti-imperial, anti-monarchic, republican, and with a lot of socialist elements to it. So they took over. In 1959, there was an attempt against Qasim's life, and it was almost certainly backed by the CIA. A last-minute recruit to that was a young man called Saddam Hussein, whose actions certainly were instrumental in the failure of that assassination attempt. He was injured and fled to Egypt. Then in 1963, there was a Ba'athist coup, almost certainly backed by the CIA. and probably planned at least in part by them. Um, but it didn't really keep power, didn't manage to concentrate power into its own hands until 5 years later, 1968, there was another Ba'athist coup. This over the next 10 years, Saddam Hussein would be vice president, but would be consolidating power more and more in his hands. Now, in 1979, Saddam Hussein becomes president. He purges the Ba'ath Party of the Ba'ath. The origins of the Ba'ath Party are in Syria, so it is a pan-Arab nationalist ideology that has a strong link to Islam, even though one of the co-founders of the party, one of the two co-founders, was Christian. But it kind of sees Islam as quintessentially Arabic, and so there were a lot of Baathists in Iraq were keen on maintaining strong links with Syria. Saddam Hussein purged them in the worst possible way, including some executions which he is supposed to have personally carried out, also forcing other parliamentarians to execute their former colleagues and so forth. Meanwhile, in neighboring Iran, the Shah was losing his grip on power, and the US was sick of him and didn't really think his rule was sustainable. They, by turns, encouraged him to crack down and then forbade him from cracking down in such a way as was kind of quite destabilizing for his regime, which was he was of course he had come to power after the 1953 coup in Iran, engineered entirely and indisputably this time, because they didn't cover their tracks back in those days, by the CIA. Although the plan originally was British, but the CIA took over. And during his reign, the CIA-trained Savak became they competed with the Korean CIA, the KCIA, for to be the most notorious torturers and abusers on the planet at the time. And they were very prolific murderers and torturers. So he was the Shah was very unpopular. Iran had a long leftist history. The Tudeh, the Communist Party of Iran, was at one point the largest after the crushing of the Indonesian Communist Party. They were the largest outside of the communist world, and they were growing in power. The US didn't really want them to take over, so a CIO memo said Khomeini's return would be preferable to a leftist-oriented military coup or a chaotic breakdown, by which they mean like that young leftists taking over, and the US had some direct and indirect communication with Khomeini and his faction, and they also could have blocked his return from Paris and chose not to. So they were instrumental in a number of small ways in making sure they kind of steered the revolution away from the leftists into the hands of the Islamists to some extent. So the Islamists take over. Um, the and obviously it's not entirely monolithic. And there is some attempt by them to work with leftists. However, in the long run, it is a very the to this day it is an Islamist regime, as we all know, and I don't know how flourishing the communists are in Iran at the moment, but they definitely don't wield power there. In 1980, the US deliberately baits Saddam Hussein into attacking Iran by feeding him false intelligence about the state of the Iranian military, claiming that telling him it's in chaos and this is his opportunity to go and grab disputed bits of territory and teach them a lesson, etc. Exactly the sort of thing that Saddam Hussein, who was their client and had been for some time, the sort of thing that they knew would appeal to him as a military strongman type. This led to an 8-year-long war that cost 500,000 to 1,000,000 deaths, plus those killed in the Anfal campaigns against the Kurds, the genocide, which cost 50 to 100,000 deaths. The Ba'athist regime used poison gas, most prolifically against the Iranians, but also against the Kurds. This was supplied by the crucial suppliers were the US, the UK, and Germany. The US armed both sides in this conflict, and they would give more. They were secret about their arming of the Iranians, but they would give more support to one side or another on the basis of who was winning. So, and by 1986 or maybe even earlier, US officials were often openly talking about how they wanted both sides to lose and they wanted both sides to suffer as much as possible. And if you think about what was actually happening, if you read about the trains of Iranian soldiers coming back after having been gassed, full of wounded, it's hard to actually kind of, I guess we all know now, we all see what's happening in Gaza, and we all know, but the brutality of these people is immeasurable. So, at the end of the war, Iraq was crippled by war debt. It owed 14 billion US dollars to Kuwait. Now, Iraq felt that it was fighting for all Arabs against the Iranian menace, and that Kuwait should forgive the debt that it owes. So Kuwait is still ruled now as emirs by the Al-Sabah family, who the British had signed an agreement with, nearly a century before at this stage. So they, the US, in secret, assures the Al-Sabah family that they will make sure that that Kuwait is safe from Iraq, and will back Kuwait no matter what they choose to do. They essentially are encouraging them to tell Iraq to go and fuck themselves, basically, and saying you're telling the Kuwaiti royal family that you will suffer no consequences from this. Now, one of the things that Kuwait does is it increases its oil production, which further antagonizes Iraq because it's causing a drop in petroleum prices. But to make things even worse, they start slant drilling in an oil field that crosses the border between Kuwait and Iraq, so that they're actually sending, well, at least according to Iraq, and I believe that this has actually been is accepted. The Kuwaitis were drilling at an angle so that they're actually taking oil out from Iraqi territory. Even if they weren't, the oil field itself is, is a finite kind of resource that crosses a border. So there is some sense that they are taking from something that I believe most of it lay on the Iraqi side of the border. Now, at this time, the US ambassador to Baghdad is April Glaspie. She's obviously been in talks with Saddam Hussein previously. He arranges to talk to her in front of TV cameras and gets her to say this on camera. This is on camera. You can look at it on YouTube if you want. She says, quote, "We have no opinion on your Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary Baker," the Secretary of State at the time, "has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in the 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America." So Hussein has this on camera, and he's foolish enough to think that the US wouldn't dare show its perfidy by going back on that. And of course, this is, not how things work, because, the way it works is that they can do whatever they want, and then they will say that it never happened. That's how it works. They will tell you the sky is green and so forth. Like Trump's notion that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and get away with it. It didn't come out of nowhere. The US has been doing this for a long time, and they learned perfidy from perfidious Albion itself. So they understand perfidy, so when Iraq did invade Kuwait, the US had an immediate reaction, and this is a dead giveaway for how perfidious they were being. It's always a rule with the US, because something very similar happened with the Korean War, also with numerous coups which they have claimed to be uninvolved in. If they react instantaneously without time for doubt or anything like that, and they say, "Oh yes, if they start mobilizing troops straight away, if they go straight to the UN Security Council saying give us permission to go and attack these guys, if they immediately recognize a coup regime, they can claim that they had no foreknowledge and no participation or whatever, but if it were true, then they would take time to work out who it is, what's happening, and so forth. In order for that to happen, it almost certainly means that they had a hand in it, right? So they acted a lot like they planned this. So what we saw next was famously the lie about babies being thrown out of incubators, very much the kind of the swinging into action of the pro-war machine, the propaganda machine that manufactures consent for war. It happens over and over again. So again, uh, when you see it happening, you know that it's not this is predestined, let's say, predetermined. It's not that a debate is being held inside the halls of power. They know where they're going. So there was also Amnesty International at first endorsed the baby incubator lies and then retracted that endorsement. Bit too late to do anything about it. They also produced a report on atrocities coming out of the occupation of Kuwait, which broke pretty much most of their normal rules for verification and so forth. Thus, like creating, and it's not necessarily that there weren't atrocities happening in Kuwait and that there wasn't a need to address that issue, but these people who take fucking a year and a half to come out and say that a genocide is happening in Gaza, like in mere weeks they rushed out while the drums of war are beating. In mere weeks they rushed out a thing providing exactly the fucking material that the US and the UK wanted to justify killing people. All right? So that then the US went to Saudi Arabia and they showed them doctored satellite imagery, which was a favorite tool of the US for a few decades there. Doctored satellite imagery of Iraqi troop build-up on the border of Saudi Arabia. Now, is this to fool the Saudis or to give them deniability about their complicity in it? I don't know. But whatever. It led to what was called Desert Shield. Months and months and months of a massive military build-up in Saudi Arabia, which reached a total deployment of 950,000 soldiers. That is enough to occupy and pacify Iraq, unlike the amount of troops they sent in when they did occupy Iraq. Now, which I'll get to later. So once Saddam Hussein realized he was in a bind, he offered to withdraw, but he kept, and this, like, both the US and the British are very lucky in history. Someone quoted one imperialist saying that they get in the skin of the other people, and I think the way I would interpret that is that they get them to kind of do what they want. And Saddam Hussein was a very useful enemy because instead of going, because he had no levers, but he still acted like he had a negotiation on his hands. The worst thing he could have done to the US was just unilaterally withdraw from Kuwait. But of course he's stuck in this mindset where he thinks that that's something to offer them. If you do, but the last thing they wanted was for him to unilaterally withdraw from Kuwait. Then they wouldn't have the war they fucking wanted. And the war they wanted, by the way, as we will see, was a pretext for committing genocide against the people of Iraq. That's why it was happening, right? That's why they told the Sabahs got them to needle Iraq and then told Iraq, we're not going to do anything about this, but you do it, and then immediately seized on that as a reason for attacking Iraq. This is not about fucking liberating Kuwait. This is about attacking the Iraqi people as such. And we will see that play out in the most horrible fucking way as we go on. So instead of just being man enough to say, oh, I fucked up, and just taking that, okay, maybe it might have led to his life being a lot shorter if he did this, I will admit. But the sensible thing to do in terms of foreign relations was to say, no, we can't sustain the occupation of Kuwait. We withdraw to our own borders straight away and, negotiate from there. Thus stealing the pretext for attacking Iraq. Instead, Saddam Hussein goes into bluster mode and talks about the mother of all battles. While the Western media, the focus of criticism for this warmongering becomes, oh no, we're going to lose lots of troops to this, totally ignoring the massive technological disparity. The fact that Saddam Hussein had to fly his aircraft to Iran, the country he'd just been at war with. All his fighter jets went there because he couldn't even protect them, let alone fly them against the US forces. So, it's not that Iraq has no air defences at all, but they're really minimal. So, it's virtually total air supremacy for the coalition. So, yeah, the Iraqi army had 1 million personnel, which is very impressive in one sense, but of course, if they don't have the weapons they can use to hit the others, then that's, it doesn't help them. And of course it didn't. It didn't help them. There was an air campaign called Desert Storm, which attacked all sorts of. They had as always, they have a theory for why. They put for priority of targets, and so that there's always a reason why such and such is a military target. So they targeted civilian things as part of that. And in fact, there was a study done by some branch of the US military, I think. I can't remember exactly, and I don't have it to hand. But anyway, they basically calculated if you bomb this water purification infrastructure, you will cause hundreds of thousands of deaths through infectious disease. And then promptly, less than 2 months later, that is exactly what the US did. They did the thing that they had studied and calculated would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. And this is, this is the way they create these abstract theories of military strategy that tend to sidestep international humanitarian law in order to justify attacking civilian infrastructure under a military pretext. But I would argue that, in fact, the appeal at some level, the green light at some level, comes from people who know are consciously attacking the Iraqi people as such, and it is an act of genocide. So Desert Storm, they also, there were many instances of civilian deaths directly, baby milk factory was bombed as supposedly under the pretext that it was actually a chemical weapons factory. A crowded bunker was bombed, killing hundreds in Baghdad, and so forth. There were other incidents. So it was very destructive and quite deadly. And then the ground assault came. It was called Desert Sabre. And this is celebrated as a great strategic triumph, which the propaganda would have us believe was the modern day equivalent of Cannae, where Hannibal surrounded the Romans and totally destroyed their forces in Italy. Again, like that would be, I mean, at this stage, the Iraqi conscripts there had been there a long time. A lot of them were starving. They were poorly equipped. The Iraqi military had certainly some things going for it. I'm not going to lie, but in the face of what the US had built up over the time, there was no real defense, and these poor Iraqi soldiers would be things like they would be in trenches, really completely unable to do anything really, and the US would basically just take along big Rome plows or armoured bulldozers, whatever, and just bury them alive and kill them that way. This was also a great opportunity for these fucking maniacs to test out weapon systems on live human beings whose only crime was to be born in a country that then put them in a uniform and sent them there. So they would try air fuel explosives, which would, if people were able to get away from the searing heat and weren't incinerated or scorched to death, they would die of asphyxiation as these things sucked the oxygen out of bunkers. And that sort of thing. So this is part of warfare now. I mean, it was always maybe an incidental part of warfare, but warfare is now the cruelest form of human vivisection. They are constantly coming up with new, horrible, disgusting ways of killing people and then finding opportunities for unleashing them. And this is happening, as we know, in Gaza today. But again, it would be wrong to separate that from what has happened in Iraq in the past. Then there was a famous incident of slaughter on the Mutla Ridge, known as the Highway of Death. Now, the fatalities are fiercely debated. They were considered very high originally, and people have talked that down over time. I'm not in a position to say that that's entirely due to propaganda. I suspect it is, but it might be that there is genuine scholarship behind that. I'm not sure. But one of the things is that hasn't really been talked about in the historiography is that leftist exiles from Iraq in the early 1990s talked about those soldiers being mutineers who were heading north to join the uprising that was happening in Basra against Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, at the time, the US rhetoric about those soldiers was the justification repeated very often was that they had not laid down their arms. So even though they were fleeing, they were considered fair game because they hadn't laid down their arms. The pictures that came out of the Mutla Ridge of all of these burnt vehicles and charred corpses are absolutely horrific. And there's certainly enough vehicles were caught in this to justify a very high casualty rate. But if the circumstances were such that those vehicles were mostly empty, then it may well be that fewer people died than previously believed. I am not sure. At the same time that very soon after the slaughter, the US was in negotiations for a ceasefire, and they imposed conditions on the Iraqi regime and made what they would later claim to be was a terrible mistake in carving out an exception to the no-fly zone for the Iraqis, allowing them to fly helicopter gunships. And those helicopter gunships were the absolutely, and predictably so, the absolutely essential tool for the Iraqi regime in quelling the uprising in Basra, and were very important as well. There was an uprising in Kurdistan as well, Iraqi Kurdistan. So the US accidentally gave them permission to do this. After the war, and this is an important thing, after the war, there was what was called Operation Provide Comfort to protect the Kurdish people in northern Iraq. Not the only place where there are Kurdish people in Iraq, of course, but this was a place of import to the US. And the second part of that, or Operation Provide Comfort 2, was a sort of war of maneuver whereby the US moved its weapons with superior range such that the Iraqi military had no choice but to withdraw. And I think this is an important demonstration. The thing is that the Iraqi military is very much a professional organization, and they don't just fight for no reason. They, if your guns have a longer range and it is useless to fight, then they withdraw. I say this because this could have happened at a later date as well, but the US chose to go a different way. So from 1991 to 2003, the US acted in various ways that actually really shored up the Saddam Hussein regime. And I don't think that that is any mistake. I don't think it was a coincidence either. I don't think it was some sort of unforced error. I think it was a key part of their strategy. At one stage, there was a plot to kill him that was mysteriously betrayed, seeing leading military opposition figures executed or exiled. And that betrayal, where did it come from? I think it was from the US. People call me paranoid, but it makes a lot of sense because without Saddam Hussein there, what would they be dealing with? And remember that there's this history of these not very compliant. Saddam Hussein was a client originally. Um, so even with their client in place, they started acting like Iraq was an enemy and luring them into a war with Iran, and then luring them into a war with Kuwait. So um, there were no-fly zones created in the north and the south, and really they were zones of total air supremacy rather than no-fly zones. The total air supremacy for the US, the UK, and France as well, because there were no air defences in those places. There was also a sanctions regime. So the one Security Council resolution. Well, the thing about Security Council resolutions is to um, actually get rid of them needs unanimity, or you can't be done when if one power vetoes it, if one of the permanent members vetoes it. And with the US and UK and France, I think France is a permanent member. Anyway, the point is that there is no way of lifting the authorizations for the use of force that occurred in 1990. So they stayed there, and then, of course, they were interpreted however it suited the US and the UK to do so. So they created a sanctions regime. This created widespread malnutrition. It also had huge economic impacts, creating poverty, and many people died because of it. In 1995, due to humanitarian concerns, there was the institution of an oil for food program under UN auspices, but the US and UK used the Security Council resolutions to basically vet everything going in and out, and they kept restrictions going, which kept the impact very high. So by 1996, someone estimated that 500,000 children had died of malnutrition. Now, it was a very, let's say, very round figure. It certainly, might well be quite a lot more than actually did die, but it was the best figure that we had at the time. And then Madeleine Albright was questioned about it late in 1996, and let's see what she had to say.
Or chemical weapons on other countries. And she says he's still lying about his weapons programs.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat?
Okay, so that became a bit notorious, obviously. Someone breezily saying that the price is worth it over when questioned about 500,000 dead children. And she didn't question that number because nobody particularly had at that time. It was kind of the we knew that a lot of people were dying, and that was the number that was given. Now, one of the things about that, of course, is that it became a very strong lesson in why you shouldn't be honest when you're doing this sort of thing. But you're really looking at an insight into the thinking of imperialism, like the logic is that not that it's not regrettable that the 500,000 children died, but rather that things would be even worse had we not brought about those deaths. And it does rather remind me of Jodie Ernst's recent, I'm not going to put the actual video up because it's being annoying, but I'll just play the audio. Jodie Ernst, US Senator, when asked about, when said that cuts to Medicaid are going to kill people, she said this.
People are not, well, we all are going to die. So, for heaven's sakes, folks.
I was in the process of answering a question that...
Okay, she then did this apology, which I'm not going to play, where she mocked them for not understanding that we're all going to die. Now, yeah, so the thing is, what it means is this, that the thinking of the people, we tend to not understand how twisted power makes people, right? So we have this saying, all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. I think people kind of think it means that you look after number one more, you become like literally corrupt as in accepting bribes. But I think what we really need to understand is that it does things to people's minds. Their judgments, like especially if they've got underlying issues with, say, racism, for example, I think this would be very common. If they were picked on in school, or they have some sort of sense of vulnerability, they have underlying hostility or aggression, then when they interpret the right thing to do, they can start leaning in towards doing very, very terrible things to other people, things that would normally be unjustifiable, on the basis that, well, we all die anyway. We need to draw a line somewhere. The consequences of inaction could be more deadly than the consequences of action, and so they lose sight of what can be morally justified, and they start to act in ways that become ever more insane and violent. And again, we only need to look at what is happening in Gaza right now to understand what that looks like. And there's lots of historical examples of this, but we all seem to think that they're not going to happen to us, our leadership. It's like something that happens to other people at other times, and we project onto our leaders like our own values. We think of them as part of our culture, and underestimate how much the actual fact of power, of that sort of hierarchical power, changes them and separates them from us. So the sanctions regime and the oil for food program were a blatant act of genocide. Which was blatant, but they could get away with it because no one was even thinking that, no one would be able to say in the mainstream media, for example, that that is what they were doing. So it becomes invisible because it's unthinkable. Some of the products banned from entering Iraq after 1995 were banned under the idea that they were dual-use products, so they could have a use for military applications as well. Now, of course, that can apply to anything. If you take it, if you're looking for a pretext rather than trying to be honest, you can apply that very broadly, and they did. So, chlorine, absolutely essential in water purification, was banned because it could be used in making chemical weapons. Pesticides were also, a lot of pesticides were banned. Some types of ballpoint pens were banned. Pencils were banned because they have graphite in them. Vehicle tires were banned because the military uses vehicles. Lots of medical equipment was banned because it often uses radioactive materials. Not that these were materials that could be weaponized, just because that was an excuse. Water pumps and pipes were banned because circular things can be used for uranium enrichment. Computers and telecommunications equipment were banned because of the obvious military and surveillance usage. I mean, which is true, but of course they're essential. I mean, they were essential even back then, Nail polish, banned. Children's toys were often banned. Bicycles and parts for bicycles were banned. So, in some ways, metals were often banned under the pretext that metal could be turned into weapons, which is true, but I mean, it's ridiculous. And after cast lead, this exact same system was imposed on Gaza, and after cast lead, they even went to the extent of saying banning cement because of dual use. So they did very similar things in Gaza, but yes, cement can be used to build bunkers, but there were still rubble and unbuilt things left over from the cast lead operation that ended in early 2009 that still hadn't been rebuilt when the Holocaust started in late 2023. Anyway, in Iraq, Dennis Halliday, who was Assistant Secretary General of the UN, was appointed in 1997 as the humanitarian coordinator for Iraq. So he couldn't stop the British and the US from basically stopping goods from entering. But he had control of this oil for food program in another sense. But he quit in 1998 and called the oil for food program genocidal. His successor was Hans von Sponeck. He also quit after a year and cited the same reasons and would later endorse Halliday's use of the term genocide for these restrictions. Meanwhile, by 1995, for anyone who was actually following the issue and wasn't a fucking, I don't know, some sort of easy mark for Western propaganda and bullshit. Everyone who had their heads screwed on and could read between the lines and knew who to trust knew that by 1995 it was established that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction worth the name. But that did not end the sanctions, nor did it end the weapons inspections. The weapons inspections, like the US put CIA officers in through the weapons inspections, so they basically undermined them to use them for espionage purposes. Then in 1998, the US ordered the weapons inspectors to leave Iraq because they were going to bomb. And then they started bombing and said it was because Iraq wasn't complying with the inspections and the UN Security Council resolutions from 1990. And they led the world to believe that Saddam Hussein had thrown the weapons inspectors out of the country and that was their reason for bombing. And the Western media was so pathetic that they kind of just went along with that, either not checking or not caring. So, like, this is the level of, again, perfidy is the only word I can think of, to these people. So, I mean, the relentlessness of their determination to inflict as much suffering on Iraq as possible, it was unmistakable. And the cruelty of it began to show cracks. And just like today with Gaza, there was, like, one of the things was that European public opinion started to affect their governments in ways that apparently public opinion doesn't really affect the governments of Anglophone countries, sadly. So it kind of looked a little bit like the sanctions regime was finite, that it had to come to an end, because if there was a split between the Anglo-West and the non-Anglo-West, then it's hard to kind of keep the pretext of moral superiority and, justification. Then 9/11 happened. And one of the things about 9/11, one of the things about that time was that though the country was the people were indeed immiserated and weaker, the nature of the sanctions had actually strengthened the regime, because they became the distribution point and essential to everyone's lives. And they had a very efficient, like, the US would lie about them stealing food and stuff like that. But even though Saddam Hussein was wasting money on stupid palaces and shit like that, the fact was they had an incredibly efficient system of distributing food that had pretty much stopped the deaths from malnutrition to a large extent. So it did in some ways strengthen the state sector, rather than causing it to fracture, as might have been wished. At the same time, Iraq decided to sell oil in non-US dollar denominations. So even though nothing at all linked Iraq to 9/11, it became the pretext for attacking Iraq again. They created this clearly ridiculous, these stories. They planted stories about yellow cake, and then made up other stories. They used the good old falsified or misrepresented satellite intelligence to create fake stories about weapons of mass destruction. They had a dodgy dossier. They clearly intended to falsify after the fact of the invasion. They were obviously going to create fake mass weapons of destruction, which I think is linked to the death of David Kelly. Anyway, it's all extremely, it's all awful, but it all points to one thing, that they were determined. These things didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't believe they were weapons of mass destruction. They made up the lies because they're determined. And we have debated about, it was such a good distraction that we didn't ask ourselves why. Why are they determined? So they were determined to get their invasion. They did it against the vast majority of world public opinion, which was very clear. The biggest anti-war march in human history happened in London, and people were roughly, they got a bare majority of the US public to just over 50% supported military intervention, and that was the highest amount anywhere in the world except possibly Israel. So the invasion happens. Their pretext for killing civilians and causing destruction of civilian infrastructure was shock and awe this time. So this was, it was kind of a refinement of the sort of 5 rings thing that had in 91, but it kind of emphasized massive destruction aimed mainly at communications and command and control, but like profligate in its nature, and designed to sow chaos. So they invade, and if anyone's seen Generation Kill, one of the things they did was send special forces just herring around the countryside, while, like way behind enemy lines, and then with whatever mission, let's go and, blow up such and such bridge or whatever, but like hundreds of kilometers into, Meanwhile, the regular army, led by professionals, the regular Iraqi army, led by professionals, would sometimes try and surrender because they knew there was no chance, especially, with the weaponry they had. There was no fighting a US invasion. So Brigadier General tried to surrender with all of his forces, and the US weren't having any of it. They didn't want them to surrender. They wanted their war. And they did. They created great chaos and just unbelievable scenes. Now, one of the things that happened, of course, was that they failed to secure the libraries, the museums and so forth, leading to all this looting. There was random destruction everywhere. And the country was in great disorder. Before the war had begun, the State Department had produced a study of what would be needed to occupy Iraq, and it was going to require, I believe, 700,000 troops, maybe 600,000, and that advice was ignored. And roughly speaking, this is like 500,000 would be the absolute minimum to expect to pacify the country. And remember, in 1990, and it did take a long time for that troop build-up, but in 1990 and 91, they built up to 950,000 troops. This time they went in with under 200,000. I can't remember, a lot under, if I remember rightly, a lot under 200,000. One of the things, I expected them to bomb the shit out of the country, create so as much chaos as possible, and then fuck off, you know, because after all these years of sanctions and stuff, I thought they were just going to destroy it as much as possible and then, you know, work diplomatically or use other means to try and destabilize, you know, through divide and rule, that sort of thing, prevent it from reconstructing and so forth. However, one thing kind of just made me click suddenly a couple of weeks after the invasion. There was a report where in Basra, around in the south anyway, US forces were there, and one of them went like this to a car. Now, you know, we're possibly familiar now with US military convention enough that we know that means halt. Certainly, I wouldn't have known that back then because I, you know, it wasn't in all the movies like it is now. What happened was they did that to a car with a family in it, and the driver went, yeah, back to them, thinking this is the solidarity salute, you know, because they were happy that their dictator had been overthrown. And then those troops slaughtered that entire family. And I thought, it just suddenly clicked. Oh shit, they're not leaving. They're going to be there killing people for a long time to come. And because things like that, for that to get to that point, there's always a lot leading to it, you know? And it's quite revealing. What happens on the ground reflects an awful lot that's happened beforehand. And you can tell a lot about what the thinking and the planning. And, you know, of course, there's always the people who say, oh, it's because they don't know, they don't understand. But, you know, like, some things are quite basic, you know. And what we saw going forward was that that sort of thing would become absolutely an epidemic of death. Exactly that sort of thing. So Joshua Key, I think it was, he was a deserter who went to Canada. He wrote a book, and he said that when he was in Iraq, they had a kind of covered over thing out the front of their base where they would just put the bodies every day for people to come and collect their relatives. There were numerous stories told of traffic control points, right, where people are expected to stop, and if they don't stop, there is an escalation of, supposedly an escalation of things you do, fire in the air, blah, blah, blah. But often there is no time for that is just kill the people. But those traffic control points don't have markings necessarily. And if you're at dusk and you've got like troops wearing army uniforms which are camouflaged, signaling to stop, you don't see it. They kill you and your family. It happened over and over and over again. And it's just one of the many ways in which the whole situation was set up so that civilians would get killed everywhere. Right? So the first and second Lancet studies, they went into Iraq, and there was an expectation that the chaos of the war would have shortened people's lifespans by depriving them even more than they were deprived under the sanctions regime. And that turned out not to be true. What they found instead was that the majority of people the excess mortality was almost all caused by traumatic injury. The majority of it was caused by small arms fire, and the majority, where the assailant was known, of that came from coalition forces. Now, what the people have questioned the Lancet 2 study in particular, which said that estimated 660,000 excess deaths in 2006. However, subsequent studies have put that in the same sort of ballpark. And the reasons for criticising their sampling method were never tested by anyone. They didn't go, well, I think this is a design for, we're going to go back and do it differently. They just sniped from the science. In fact, it's not that they might not have made mistakes. It's always possible. There might be sampling errors that lead to bias. But one thing is for sure, there is going to be a certain undercount that comes from the families where everyone is wiped out, because they go to people and get testimony about what family members they've lost, what household members they've lost. Many of the munitions used by the US would destroy all families with no trace left. So we're seeing the same in Gaza now. That is very hard. Like that, the reported mortality is clearly an increasingly small fraction of the actual mortality, and we're not just talking about people lost under the rubble that are known about. There are just lots of people who are not known about. And one of the things about Gaza is that I think that they have built an incredible reporting system, and people are aware that it's necessary to report as much as possible. So they're probably capturing a higher percentage than in other places. But there are studies showing that the sort of system whereby instead of estimating the number of deaths through statistical means, if you try and count the deaths, you end up with less deaths the more violent it gets. So your count goes down when the actual reality goes up. In Iraq, we had this horrible thing called Iraq body count, which was a disgusting piece of propaganda pushed to mislead people into vastly underestimating how many people have been killed. And in order to be counted as dead in Iraq body count, you had to be identified in 2 Western media sources. Now, how many Western media sources? I mean, it wasn't just, there were embedded journalists, of course, and the Western media didn't just rely on Western journalists, but it's ridiculous. Their coverage was appalling, and the number they caught, the number they counted wouldn't even have was less, for example, at least one stage than the number going through the Baghdad morgue alone. And that's just one morgue. That's not even how many people died in Baghdad that didn't go to that morgue, So this is, part of the way they deal with these things in Iraq and in Palestine is to play these numbers games where you require a certain burden of proof, an unreasonable burden of proof, and you suppress the numbers, all while saying, oh, you can't, numbers are, it's crude to talk about numbers. These things, they try and imply that there's a certain qualitative nature to violence based on how nice the person doing the murdering is and what their intentions are. And so you can't compare 100 people killed by Israel in self-defense to 100 people killed by Hamas, who wants to destroy the state of Israel and exterminate all Jews, because a lot of people die in a much more cruel way. And so they like to say that you can't, that weapons are numbers are crude and not reflective of the reality, and at the same time they're incredibly important when they want to make a point about the numbers killed. So every single fucking fingernail of every Israeli is accounted for. And they put a massive amount of effort into making sure that's the case, and then they also just add more on top. They top it up. Because numbers are meaningless, except of course they're not. We all know they're not. They're very important. And at the same time, they deliberately suppress the ability to count or estimate the numbers killed at their hands. And this, again, is a lesson from Iraq taken to Palestine. So this initial invasion sows chaos everywhere. And then they institute these kind of military governorships where they put high-level Marine and Army officers in charge of areas, and those areas have different rules. Some of them let every household have an AK-47, for example, for some time, and said it was necessary or cultural or something like that, which is quite an interesting ploy if you're facing an insurgency. Well, of course, they weren't facing an insurgency to begin with. Even really up till the sieges of Fallujah in 2004, nobody had an appetite for fighting the US. They were just saying, thank you for throwing out Saddam Hussein. When are you going to leave? That was a very common, talking point. Every time someone poked their camera in the face of an Iraqi in 2003, that was kind of what they'd be saying. But, the US didn't want that. They hadn't sent enough troops to occupy the country, but they decided to occupy it anyway. And yeah, so these different military areas would also have different rules of engagement as well, so creating even more confusion. And then early in 2004, there were terror attacks, started, car bombings. Now, we know that some of these were false flag attacks. In one instance, in Iraqi police pulled over a car full of what appeared to be Arabs with, they were suspecting like Mujahideen al-Khalq or something like that coming from Iran. These people were in a car dressed as Arabs with explosives. It turned out to be the SAS. They took them to the police station. Then the British sent tanks and got them out. So the questions were never answered. There were a lot of people in Baghdad reported being unwittingly people trying to use them as car bombers. So one guy got a job to drive a car to a certain place and then ring a number to tell someone he was there. He gets there, he's got a cell phone. They've given him a cell phone, he's supposed to ring this number, or maybe it was his own cell phone. There's no reception. So he gets out of the car, he leaves the car in a place and walks, trying to find reception, walks a wee distance away, calls the number, bam, the car blows up. Now, this sort of story, like Patrick Coburn tells the story, but he's like, oh, the Arab street, oh, they're paranoid, blah, blah, blah. But there were, even he had to admit that there was so much of this sort of stuff around, this testimony, that, it's pretty hard to explain without it being true. And I think that, like, this idea of the Arab street being, like, paranoid or, silly in their beliefs is racist. These people have been through a lot and they judge the world on the basis of what they've fucking well seen, right? And I think they're actually probably their judgment was better in this instance than the self-righteous, po-faced Western media. Anyway, that was hardly the only thing that the US was doing that created chaos and sowed the seeds of insurgency and then later civil war. They used the process of de-Baathification as a kind of attack on, like a lot of people, in order to get their job at certain levels, had to join the Ba'ath Party. Just, it's just a box ticking exercise if you want to be like a hospital administrator or run a department at a university. So they start purging people without regard to their ideology, but rather creating this system of purging. And at the same time, there were these abductions started up, so that people with high positions, with wealth, were often abducted and killed. And then death squads started up. And then the US was linked with the death squads, and also including like members of Saddam Hussein's Mukhabarat, the secret police, the internal police force, internal security force, who were recruited by the US to through as a kind of through the kind of vague pretext of de-Baathification. And then, they became associated with, particularly with using electric drills as a method of torture and execution. They sent in, they brought in a guy called John Negroponte, who had been, had worked in El Salvador, among other places, a very hardline right-wing cold warrior. And they openly talked about the Salvador option, referring to starting a death squad program to do what they needed to do. Now, not sure what else to talk about, but like in these circumstances, it's hardly surprising that an insurgency started up. You know? And, I don't want to go into details, but the US was crucial in the things they did were necessary for an insurgency to arise. Their policies gave means, motive, and opportunity. Let's put it that way. And certainly, their policies made sure that there were weapons available for it, and not just the one where households could have an AK-47 each. There were other ways in which the US would take weapons and just dump them in the desert without kind of securing them at all at one stage. And of course, their own profligate use of firepower, as happened in Indochina and as is happening in Gaza, is a source of weaponry for their enemies. It's always been the case. All of those IEDs you would later hear about, they come from unexploded. Well, not all, but a lot of it comes from unexploded US ordnance. So they acted as the supply for their enemies. And again, like this is not new. This was part of the Vietnam War, especially up until 1968. So the motive, the studies actually show that the prime reason for anyone to take up arms against the US was not some sort of religious fanaticism or political belief system. It was losing relatives or being mistreated. It was, again, like, it's not like this isn't known. The standard counterinsurgency doctrine is that, if you treat people badly, you will create more insurgents. And a lot of people at the time were saying, I think, like fucking idiots, that the US was too focused on fighting conventional war and didn't know how to fight an insurgency. Well, I want to point out here and now that the Indian wars were an insurgency. Then the US went to fucking the Philippines and Cuba, fought an insurgency, counterinsurgency. It sent its Marines into Haiti and other places in the 30s and so forth. And then after some of its warfare in the Pacific was kind of like counterinsurgency. Then before 1950 in Korea, it was fighting counterinsurgency. And during the Korean War, it was fighting counterinsurgency behind the lines sometimes as well. And then it more or less took over the running of the French War in Indochina, fought another counterinsurgency. Of course, this is not even counting everything they've been doing in fucking Latin America for just about right back to the Monroe Doctrine, which could be considered counterinsurgency. Then there was, so literally 30 years of counterinsurgency in Indochina. And then they go to a war and people start saying, oh, the thing about the Americans is they don't understand counterinsurgency. Of course they fucking understand counterinsurgency. There is not a power on earth that has had more experience in fighting insurgencies than they have. So, sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but it just fucking frustrated me at the time because it's a clear, this, there's government propaganda, and then there's just propaganda that people will fucking pull out of their own asses and spout, because they're so indoctrinated about a certain way of looking at the world. And I get very frustrated when they talk such shit. Anyway, so I mentioned earlier, like, this idea that people are starting to say, well, this is, you know, we might be looking at a third world war happening right now. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe. The thing is, what a lot of people openly talked about the so-called long war after 9/11. So the global, first there was the war on terror, then it became the global war on terror, and then some people refer to it as the long war. Now, you might, you know, as people have pointed out many times, terror is a tactic. Having a war against it doesn't necessarily make sense, except, of course, if terror is your pretext for a world war. You are trying to create a new regime whereby your dominance of oil when that stops being as crucial to controlling other countries. So the US controlling the oil of the Middle East, it controls it not because it wants to use it. It doesn't use Middle Eastern oil. It controls it in order to control other countries. So, and you know, this is why we have the Carter Doctrine, which says that the US will intervene to ensure the flow of Middle Eastern oil, and that oil is meant to be paid for in US dollars, which keeps people investing in US bonds so that they can have dollar reserves, etc., etc., etc. It's just, it's a whole thing, and I've talked about it elsewhere. I'm not going to explain it all here and now. But the thing is that obviously, although petroleum is not going to become useless, especially for military power in the foreseeable future, its centrality to the basic economic functioning of countries is not going to last forever, one way or another. And there is a very strong sense that the long war was aimed at securing the next paradigm of control, partly by suppressing countries, by destabilizing and destroying them, so that they can't use the last, you know, the post-Cold War era to exploit petroleum to build up a rival power. And obviously this applies very much to Iraq, but you know, not only do countries have oil, but sometimes they have oil pipelines that are crucial as well, and these are all areas that can be exploited for national development, and that weakens the empire's grip. So that is why the long war is happening. I think that it could well be described as World War III. Certainly the scale over time definitely is that of a world war. Is also, you know, in part of this is the fight for Africa as well, the institution of AFRICOM in Africa as part of that. So so I think what we have to understand is that empires work by dividing people. And one of the worst things perhaps about seeing the memory of what's happened in Iraq misrepresented so badly is that the way forward has to come from solidarity for all people, you know, because empires aren't run. It's not that the people of the US benefit from the US empire, nor do they control it. The empire forms its own constituency that is, for whom the nation state of the US is a tool, not an end, you know. They don't care about the US being strong or weak or whatever. If they want it strong, it's so that, I mean, look at their policies in the US. It has greatly weakened that country, but created a massive military power and a weak state. You know, that's not benevolence, and that's not patriotism or whatever. So, I mean, I do think that the solidarity has to be among all people against a predatory imperial class, and you destroy solidarity by making by this sort of amnesiac, like denying the suffering of one people in order to try and bring attention to the suffering of another. I understand it. I mean, our time seems very urgent at the moment, but I think it's urgent that we understand how this relates to everything. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. So, yeah, just in terms of books to read, I recommend Tariq Ali's Bush in Babylon, which is very good, but it bases a lot of its material on a book by Hannah Batatu, who is there's not many countries where you go, well, there's the historian, and he wrote in English as well, which is maybe there are more authoritative Arabic works out there, but as far as I know, there is one book that up to a certain point is considered the history of modern Iraq, and it was written by Hannah Batatu, who is Palestinian, and it's called The Old Social Classes and Revolutionary Movements of Iraq, a study of Iraq's old landed and commercial classes and of its communists, Baathists and free officers. So quite a mouthful of a title. It's a very long book. Now I could only get it out of a library and only managed to read half of it, but it's very it's quite informative, and again another link between Palestine and Iraq. I mean they're not a million miles apart geographically either. You have to say it's not that they're not direct neighbours, but they're not super far apart. Another book I would recommend, and I can't remember the author's name. Between Two Rivers. It's about cuneiform and stuff in Mesopotamian culture and ancient Mesopotamia and all sorts. That's interesting, and it's quite a recent book. And yes, and of course I haven't read it all yet, but the book I was quoting from, where is it? Follow the Pipelines by Charlotte Dennett, whose dad worked for the OSS and then the CIA and then died in a plane crash rather mysteriously, and she tried to find out about it. And found out a lot about oil. Oh, actually, that's another one. Now that I think about it, like up until a certain point, well, for most, up until recently, people who wrote about oil geopolitics were put in a kind of ghetto. So there's, I think, a good book. I don't know, maybe I might find flaws in it if I revisited it, a book called A Century of War by William Engdahl, that puts, I give a qualified recommendation, but anyway, it puts everything in the context of fight for oil, which is central, but it absolutely absent from normal historiography. It's like it's not there. And which is weird, and actually, like, it's not even there in a lot of stuff about, like, I mean, there's we talk about climate change without understanding the strategic necessity of oil and was the role it plays. Something which Malcolm Harris is addressed in his recent book, What's Left, which I haven't read, but I heard him interviewed on One of 200, and I recommend that. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted here, but the point is that oil is starting to creep into Orthodox historiography, and there's a book, a history called Between the Lines, that actually is about the imperial carve up of the Middle East, but it deals with the oil issue, and I was very pleasantly surprised by that. So, and again, like, can't remember the name of the author, so I should have prepared better and written these down, but I didn't. You can look it up. I do recommend it. All right, I will stop now, and thank you for sticking with me through all of this, and I hope it's informed you and made you angry in the right way. All right, catch you next time.